So I've been looking out recently into the part of Manchester's history after the Second World War, specifically around planning of the city into the future. So already we've looked at the neighbourhood clearances of Hume, the development of the Mancunian Way, and the Selneck Road Master Plan in 1962. Now all of this era we think of as a 60s planning era, so concrete everywhere, straight lines, masculine architecture, brutalist boxes and stuff like that. But really, it's not 60s planning. It's not 60s planning, it's a 60s updated version of ideas that came from the 40s when the war was still being fought. And in the particular case of Manchester, there was an urban master plan drawn up which wanted to design the city to be the most perfect utopian version of itself. This is the City of Manchester Plan 1945. Look at it, isn't it brilliant? The graphic design on that is wonderful. Now, it's probably the single most important document ever produced about Manchester. And this is only the cover, of course. It's like 360 pages long. So a massive waste of time printing all that off and a massive waste of paper as well. It's free online anyway in digital format, so I'll link to that in the description below. Now, I call it the single most important document ever produced about the city because it's less of a plan and more of a deep, wide-ranging study into the past, the present, and the potential future of the city. And because it was so comprehensive, many of its ideas went on to influence the planning that happened around here for decades afterwards, from council houses, road ideas, the development of Europe's largest council estate down at Wythenshawe, green corridors, urban parks, and so on. And to be honest, no matter what you think of it, and of course we'll get to that later on, the more I look at it, the more I realise it's actually a work of genius. The author and the people he's obviously collaborated with on this report have basically redesigned the city in this spider web, onion layered design, creating the most idealistic version of the city, but at the same time taking into consideration what is already there, including lots of major roads and parks and stuff like that. So every neighbourhood has a little business district, a little shopping district, green spaces, and even a smattering of light industry dotted here and there. And as anyone who's ever played a city simulator computer game will tell you, that's usually the best way to do it. Now, throughout Manchester, the weird shaped, elongated Manchester, much of this did come to pass, although thankfully a lot of it also didn't. But what I want to do in this video is look at the city centre itself, because not much of this actually came to pass. Manchester city centre is still chaotically organised and still follows the same general street pattern it has for centuries. So what did they envision for the city centre and what went wrong? So this was written by city surveyor and engineer Roland Nicholas, and he states at the very beginning that all of this was prepared under wartime conditions, and that kind of complicated things because the face of Manchester may be changed in any one night. So city planners in and around 42-43 were already thinking about what Manchester would look like after the war was over. And not just what it would look like, but how it would function, how it would use its space and resources, and so on. Now this makes sense because for the previous 2 years before that, Manchester, like a lot of cities, had suffered really badly in Nazi air raids, leaving damaged, burnt out and devastated buildings across the city centre. So planning what to do with those plots of land afterwards was the logical thing to do. But it hadn't been damaged enough, according to Nicholas, who struggles to hide the mild subtext by stating that the city would be little altered, that it would cost more to remove undamaged buildings, and that initial idealism had been tempered by a growing preoccupation with present realities. So what did it want to do about the city centre then? Firstly, it points out something I try and mention as often as I can in these videos, is that the city centre historically developed solely around commercial progress and did so rapidly that hardly any land was given to the use of public space. Of the inner 340 acres, only 5.5 are devoted to public space. And over the wider 1,100 acres, the total is only 8. The 1945 plan also notes that the old Victorian buildings are too badly built to be expanded upwards, are covered in shabby signs that overhang each other, and it's all too cluttered and densely populated. In other words, all of this was too commercial, too privately owned, and not green enough. Industrial capitalism had been fostered on Manchester's streets, and as it turned out, it was at its most purest form. An obsession with making money, everything else comes a distant second. The plan suggests 4 things needed to be done to humanise the city again and future-proof it for the new technological age. 1. Redraw the road system. 2. Split the city into zones that have different uses. 3. Create architectural balance. And 4. Improve public transport by rail and road. And this is the zoning map from the plan, and I printed it off purely so I can just sit with it and soak it all in, because I love stuff like this. But also, so I can break out the trusty highlighter pens. Look at that, 5 in 1 there, and I can colour it in for you if I can, and you can see more clearly what I'm talking about. So first of all, we'll look at the roads. These white lines here, obviously the roads, and this one here is the city circle road, punctuated by roundabouts, of course, and this one around here, kind of circle, is called the inner ring road. Also lots of roundabouts around there, and it goes, of course, into Salford. Now, it's important to note that this one entirely sits within the city centre as we know it today. In fact, this large roundabout here is exactly where the Bridgewater Hall is today, and this one up here is at the top of Deansgate next to the cathedral. So that's kind of the scale we're talking about. And also fun to notice that the inner ring road itself kind of follows Great Ancoats Street there, but this line at the bottom there is almost exactly the route of the Mancunian Way, which we've looked at in a previous video, meaning that this idea of having a ring road around the south of the city centre was the only part of this plan which was really followed up on when it comes to the city centre. But we'll come back to roads in a little bit, because next we're going to look at the civic zones. So the civic zones there, I'm going to colour in orange, and the pen is running out because I obviously don't use highlighter pens often enough. There you go. So there's 3 there's 3 major zones, civic zones, and these are where you find the libraries, the museums, the administrative offices, and the town hall. It includes this one here, the very big one at the centre now. The town hall and the library, etc., are kind of already here in this zone, but this zone's been extended this way across the line of Deansgate and onto the other side. There's actually an artistic illustration of part of this area in the plan. This road here is Deansgate, and here is Rylands Library, and we're looking towards the town hall. This is the library and the town hall extension, which was very new by the time the plan had been put together, so of course both of those get to stay. The town hall itself is new, of course, quite a simple style, and what is today Brasenose Street has been replaced by this wide boulevard of trees. The second picture of this civic zone takes us behind the artist of the first, as if you're hovering above where Salford Central Station is today. So here we've got Rylands Library, and over here Sunlight House, 2 of only a handful of buildings allowed to remain standing as part of the plan. The River Irwell runs through this part of the image here, but it's been hidden underground to provide more surface space for this road. And this huge building lines up perfectly with the new town hall and the Green Boulevard. And this is the new Law Courts building, massive and dominant. Then we've got these areas here, stripy areas for shopping. Lots of shopping, designated shopping areas, retail, stuff like that. There's a line going down, I presume Oxford Street. This is what is currently the bottom end of Deansgate. And these other areas, these other stripy ones, are entertainment. They're just set aside for entertainment, theatres, bars, nightclubs, stuff like that, you know, pubs. The dark areas here, which I'm not going to highlight because there's no point, they're quite obvious, those are just called business. Now I take that to mean commercial things, banking, insurance, that type of thing, and they're all nicely spread out in clusters again across the city. Now, these stripy, slippery suckers going like this, nice and rough, like Bob Ross. There you go, Bob Ross. Are the rivers and the canals. Now, what's interesting about this is they don't seem very significant to this plan. In fact, they don't seem to really affect the zoning of the area. But you'll notice that they all kind of end in this kind of area. They kind of stop abruptly in the middle of the city centre. So the River Irwell, for example, stops here and then disappears underground. It doesn't re-emerge again until about Bridge Street here into Salford. This image is from 1939, looking south, and you can see the cathedral, Deansgate here, the river here, Chetham's Library here, and the Corn Exchange here. And as you can see, all of this is very cluttered with the old Victorian, well, clutter, the arch nemesis of this report, by the way. So the proposed idea is to open this area up completely, and there's this beautiful connection between the cathedral and Chetham's Library. It's very open now, and the River Irwell has been completely culverted in this section and is now a beautiful green linear park. Now, while this looks good, and remember, most artistic impressions of a proposal always look good, you have to remember this is utterly unrealistic and unworkable. And you'll notice there's no River Medlock. The River Medlock should be down here, meandering its way through the south of the city centre like it does today, but that has been entirely culverted along its length. Now that, of course, is to make use of the surface. In this plan, rivers and streams and waterways are seen as an obstacle to planning, not something to be taken seriously into consideration. Now, as it turns out, the other colours in this highlight pen don't work, so we won't bother with them. Now, it means we have to go to the black, which is okay because we can use it for our last zone. Now, this area here, the dark grey, this is the railway infrastructure of the city. I'll just highlight roughly there, blah blah, and it runs down here and on and on and on. Now, most of this is in place already, and it's been in place for over 100 years at this point. But you notice two huge additions, this and this, two massive stations to serve the city centre. This one over here on Piccadilly, many times the size of the current Piccadilly station, by the way. This is a humongous train station, and on this map, on this plan, it's called London Road. And the same over here, pretty much where Salford Central Station is today, is this additional station they've created called Trinity. And this, again, I can't exaggerate enough, is humongous for a train station. It's multiple times the size of Victoria, which is around here. Dozens of lines going into that Trinity station. This is the kind of future mass transport that this plan takes into consideration. The other ones are still there, of course, as well as notably a link here across the River Irwell, like the Ordsall Cord, which was built a few years ago. But just look at the scale of these two big stations. Trinity Station alone seems to take up about 1 million hectares, about 3 times the size of current Victoria Station footprint, arena and all. According to this other illustration, it also seems to have about a dozen lines coming out of it, which seems a tad optimistic and also a bit of a shame considering what train ridership numbers are today. Now, what cracks me up about this map is that the plan has previously said that the city centre lacks green spaces, and this is something I go on about all the time in my videos, is that the city centre was rushed. It just happened to grow as it happened to grow, and nobody really thought about leisure spaces, green spaces, making it pretty or anything like that. But this plan proposes that the best way to introduce green spaces to the city centre is with these roundabouts in the middle of roads. It says use the roundabouts as leisurely green spaces. And okay, yeah, you've got here Piccadilly Gardens, but look, next to that you've got a huge roundabout, and then all the other green spaces are all roundabouts. So it's expecting that people, civilians, pedestrians, cross a main road and go sit in the middle of a roundabout and eat their lunch, socialise, sunbathe, do all the things you do in a nice green civic space in the middle of a city, but with cars going around you. The only true park left in the city centre in this plan is Piccadilly Gardens, which the plan already says is pretty good in 1939, but by virtue of being the largest open space. So to improve it, it suggests keeping its open nature, but actually putting a large amusement centre at one end, where currently Piccadilly Plaza is today. But I don't know if you can tell already why all of this is again unworkable, utterly unrealistic. And the reason is because this map and all of the illustrations we've seen have been designed around the road system. Roads were seen as the veins of the city, avoiding traffic jams at key places, keeping cars flowing in and around and through the city was seen as the utmost priority of the plan. But now, as we saw in the Mancunian Way video, planners of the 40s, 50s and 60s were smart enough to anticipate an upsurge in the amount of cars and lorries on Britain's roads. And so they started to plan this road network of wider roads, straighter roads, all with the idea of moving traffic about more efficiently and more quickly. But as we learnt the hard way, and as many an urbanist YouTube channel loves to point out again and again and again, cities should be designed for people, not for cars. When you encourage cars into a city centre, you prevent it from being as accessible as possible for pedestrians, for the people who live and work in that city centre. This shouldn't be hemmed in by traffic lights, loads of car parks everywhere. I mean, the plan even specifically mentions that the good thing about spacing taller buildings out to allow more light into offices actually gives you more room at street level to give each building its own little car park out front. But imagine that in actual practical sense. Imagine if every building in Manchester had a little car park somewhere around its footprint. It'd be insane. It'd take ages to walk from one building to another. Everything would be spread out. There'd be cars, there'd be traffic trying to pull out everywhere. It's just completely unworkable. Walkable, human-scale cities always come out the best. People have a natural aversion to cars. We just don't like being around a lot of them. So having loads of major roads and very fast-paced roads in the city centre makes the city centre a place people don't want to be. So what you might notice is that there's no residential, specifically residential areas within the city centre, and that's because the trend was that fewer people were living in the city centre, and this plan predicts that at some point in the future nobody would really live in the city centre. Where would they live? Of course they'd live outside, in the outskirts, in the neighbourhoods which have been properly zoned in this plan. But this was a problem, not something to embrace, and by the 1980s this trend had continued and the city centre became a little bit like a ghost town. Everything kind of shut except a few of the bits of the nighttime economy, like a few bars and a few restaurants and a few clubs. And it started to become a little bit unsafe, it started to feel a little bit sketchy. But by the 1990s, living in the city centre had slowly become more and more trendy, which actually made it a little bit safer, and the nighttime economy began to flourish quite quickly. And then the city centre got more investment as developers, of course, wanted to jump on the bandwagon and make loads of money from letting properties. And again, this isn't a video to go into the evils of vulture landlordism or the stupidity of the British housing market, but it does touch on the last thing to mention about the 1945 plan, and something we still struggle with even today, 80 years later. It's to do with the clearing away of poor neighbourhoods, the brushing away of the working classes. Now, Britain has got a very terrible history of this, but so has Manchester, surprisingly. After the Second World War, planners looked at cities and towns up and down the country and saw these areas of poor neighbourhoods, but places which had the potential to have high land value, and then they created schemes to clear them out. So they used the excuse of poorly built Victorian houses, which wasn't always the case, by the way. Not all of them, these Victorian terraced houses, were that badly built. But they used that excuse to say to these people, you've got to go. We'll build you a nice house somewhere else, but you've got to move out of this area. And in this case, in Manchester's case, that meant further away from the city centre. The plan was ultimately well-intentioned, well thought out, and certainly well researched, but it was very, very paternalistic. It forgot that cities actually grow organically as our society grows and learns. And sometimes those tight, narrow streets bring us joy, and a messy, scattered street pattern actually brings us a little bit of warmth. And ultimately, these streets are our streets. They hold our history. You cannot wipe them away and expect people to feel the same about a city. Cities probably should be messy because we're messy. The human race is a massive mess, and our cities reflect us as we kind of grow and reflect them. So the conclusion is that while Manchester has never really been a pretty city, it has a messy street pattern and it's still dominated by private land ownership, the wholesale clearance of the city centre, like the 45 plan suggested, was just the wrong approach. The snobbery can be seen in this image I've been using, which was on the inside cover of the report. It's a fanciful imagining of what the city centre could look like in 2045, 100 years after the report was published. Bar a few buildings deemed worthy enough of the report's snobby views, it's basically suggesting that everything we know and love about Manchester isn't good enough. So imagine that: Piccadilly Station gone, Canal Street gone, Whitworth Street gone, Sacha's Hotel gone, the Northern Quarter gone, this, and this, all gone. 100 places in this chaotic city that you might hold memories where part of your life played out. It all means nothing to this report. So earlier when I said the 1945 plan was a work of genius, when it comes to the city centre, this plan is snobby, elitist and authoritarian garbage. By not even understanding the simplest principle of what makes a city, i.e. the connection of the people to the history, it shows itself for being what it is: a bureaucratic fever dream of a world without ordinary people in it. And yeah, today Manchester needs a little work here and there, but don't we all?